Chapter 4 is the beginning of the second part of my book, and it consists, this second part, of chapters 4 and 5 that deal respectively with audiovisual translation models and research methods in audiovisual translation. So basically what I do in this second part is I provide an overview, a critique of the main theoretical frameworks and research methods that have been used and are being used to investigate different forms of audiovisual translation. So as I say, chapter 4 looks specifically at the way in which we have theorized and we continue to theorize audiovisual translation. I begin this chapter by drawing the reader's attention to the fact that the move from practice to theorization in our field has been relatively recent, and I examine the causes for this. So there are a number of practical, logistical reasons why it is objectively more difficult, time-consuming, tedious, challenging to do research on how audiovisual texts are translated vis-a-vis how literary texts are translated, for example. But then I also refer to the opinions of a number of authors who have identified what we might regard as myths about audiovisual translation. So there are opinions, for example, whereby audiovisual translation would appear to be a theoretical sort of form of translation. So it doesn't lend itself to theoretical description. And one of the main reasons for this, for example, is that ultimately it's really a form of adaptation rather than translation. So there are bound to be changes during the process that cannot really be explained in the way you can account for the changes that arise during the process of, again, literary translation. So after looking at this shift from practice to theorization, which, as I say, is relatively recent, I try to articulate what seems to be the widely held view within the field as to where we are with the theorization of audiovisual translation. And I draw the reader's attention to opinions that say that well, we still face a lack of systematic work when it comes to theorizing audiovisual translation. So, we haven't quite yet reached the degree of theoretical sophistication as other branches of translation studies have. But at the same time, chronologically even, we have other people who have very different opinions and consider that that we have reached a sufficiently developed status in terms of theoretical development. What I think is quite clear and common to these two camps I've been outlining to some extent is the idea that audiovisual translation research at the moment is still reliant on allochthonous translation models. And by allochthonous I mean theoretical frameworks which are imported from other areas of translation studies, and that ideally we should be moving to autochthonous models of translation research. In other words, models that are developed within audiovisual translation and for audiovisual translation. Chapter 4 is one of the longest in the book, and I think that it's okay for this to be the case because it covers quite a lot of ground. It draws the reader's attention to a lot of work that has been done over several decades. Even though it is not my intention to provide an exhaustive overview of everything that has been done, because first of all it wouldn't be possible, and secondly is not probably that necessary anyway, because what we need to identify is the main types of translation frameworks that have been used and the strengths and weaknesses of each of them for the purposes of audiovisual translation research. So I begin my overview with a discussion of the notions of theory, model, and method, because these are terms that certain people use interchangeably. It is, I think, important to look at what has been done in other fields within translation studies to agree on how best to use these terms. And so I reserve the term method for the following chapter, for chapter 5, and settle for model as the best way to describe the different conceptual frameworks that have been used to inform research in audiovisual translation. So my overview looks at three main types of translation models used in audiovisual translation research. The first of which is process models. So process models is a term that in my chapter designates any form of audiovisual translation research that tends to focus on how the translator's mind works during the translation, the mediation process. And so I divide this section on process models into an analysis of psycholinguistic approaches, of cognitive approaches, and neurolinguistic approaches, which are all very interesting and I personally think have been traditionally underrepresented in the literature. I move on then to look at comparative models, that is, studies that tend to chart relations of correspondence, of equivalence between the source text and the target text. And contrary to the process models, the comparative models are the ones that have received more attention in the literature. In my chapter, I have divided studies using comparative models of translation research into two main approaches, which are the shift-based approaches and the corpus-driven approaches. By shift-based approaches, I refer to studies that tend to, or that set out to identify changes that arise during the translation process, some of which are very small, micro-linguistic. In some other cases, they tend to be wider and broader in scope and tend to do with cultural preferences in the target language community, for example. Whereas corpus-driven approaches are very useful in that they help us understand, or they will in due course help us understand, what are the specific features of subtitle and dubbed language vis-a-vis other forms of translated language and indeed non-translated languages that can be identified through the use of large collections of electronic texts or corpora. Finally, there's an overview of causal models. These are the ones that tell us, or that try to tell us, why translation works or looks the way it does. And I've grouped the different studies that I find come under this heading into two main sections, which are the system approaches and the norm-based approaches. So as I said, this is a very long chapter which I've tried to make as reader-friendly as possible. I've used a number of breakout boxes where I illustrate and complement the discussion of theoretical concepts. I try to provide clear definitions of what I mean by each term sometimes within the body of the text, sometimes through the glossary at the end of the book. And I think is a very interesting chapter in that it shows to us the extent to which translation can be influenced by either very very specific and material factors such as visual prominence, narrative saliency of certain elements within the audiovisual text, but also by other much more abstract and difficult to pin down concepts like ideology, gender, power differentials, market size, or cultural prestige.